Hello, yes, this is Kevin Rice, and I'm the field crop entomologist for the University of Missouri. And today I'm just going to be giving a brief update on some of our key insect pests in Missouri field crops, mostly centered on the soybean gall midge and Japanese beetle. So soybean gall midge is a new species of insect recently discovered, actually, and it was first reported in Iowa in 2011, and it had a limited distribution, but in 2018, we observed this widespread population explosion and infestation in our neighboring states. And if you've seen me talk at Extension before, I've been talking about this species and predicting that it would invade our state, because if you look at the map over here on the left, those were the yellow counties over here, and our neighboring states had infestation, so it was highly likely that it would move into Missouri. And in fact, in 2019, we had our first detection in Atchison County. And then again, in this year, we discovered it in Holt County. So it is in Missouri, and it is a primary pest of soybeans. And we expect it to spread throughout the state as it continues to move. So the initial signs of infestation for this insect are these darkening stem bases. You can see here in the picture, the first few inches at the stem base becomes dark and brittle. And if you snap those beans off and peel the epidermis off and look closely, you can see this orange midge or several midges. They do congregate in multiple numbers, several midges underneath the skin feeding on the plant. The adults, you're not going to see the adults. They're very flighty. They move a lot, and this is what they look like. They're very similar to the Hessian fly. But again, you're not going to notice the adults in the field. You're going to see the signs and symptoms of the larvae feeding along the edges of soybean plants. So that's the close-up of the larva. When you peel back the epidermis, initially the larvae are clear, and then within a few days they turn this bright orange, very, very noticeable. In fact, there aren't any other insects in our systems in soybeans that look like this. So it's a very easy to ID insect pest when you do have it in your fields. The damage associated with the pest. So unfortunately, it looks as though all reproductive and vegetative plants and all varieties are currently very susceptible to this new insect species. However, it does seem like when it moves into a field, it is an edge species, and it can have dramatic losses along the edge, but it doesn't go into the field as far as some of our other key pests. So our initial damage reports from our neighboring states show that you can have up to 100% losses in the first 100 feet along the field edge, and then 20% lossage in the second 100 feet. So it is causing serious economic damage. And again, you're getting nutrient and water loss from the feeding underneath the skin, but then it can actually lead to plant death when those stems get very brittle. They can snap, and you have 100% yield loss where you have infestations. Again, I said edge species and all maturity groups are susceptible. Unfortunately, we found that there are multiple generations per year and overlapping generations. And that makes it very hard to manage. Right now, there is no pheromone trap or monitoring system that we have efficiently or effectively discovered. So as of now, there are no current management options. And that's simply because the adult flies are out for several weeks with the overlapping generation. So you would have to spray almost consistently for control. And that's just not economically viable right now. We are mapping the continued movement and distribution of this insect pest. So if you see these signs and symptoms in your fields, we ask that you contact your local extension offices. And the more we track this, we're also working with our neighboring states to look at pesticide timing and efficacy for management control options in the future. But we don't have any as of now. But again, if you can report infestations, that would help us greatly in the future. So moving on to our next one, Japanese beetle. Of course, this is one of our key pests in both corn and soybean in Missouri. And a lot of growers have noticed that last year they weren't as big as a problem. So we had much lower populations in 2019, and that was expected. That was because of the drought in 2018. So the larvae feed on grass roots. And when those grass roots dry up, they knock down their population. Currently, we're sort of past the peak emergence right now. So the peak emergence is sort of in July. However, the adults feed and live for approximately 45 days. So we aren't out of the woods yet. There's less adults emerging, but they're still active and they're still feeding. So you do need to scout your fields for at least throughout the month of August for Japanese beetle damage. So in corn, of course, we're only concerned about them feeding on the silks. They do cause some relatively minor leaf damage, but it's only when there is silking and they're feeding on those silks does it cause economic damage. And of course, if they're feeding on the silks before pollination is complete, you have reduced ear field and yield loss. So our thresholds for corn, this is all online as well in our fact sheets on our IPM page at the University of Missouri. The thresholds for Japanese beetle are not solely taken into abundance like we do for some of our other insect pests. It's a highly mobile pest and it has an aggregation pheromone. So it has clusters and it can be very spotty in the field. So you do need to do a decent job of scouting the entire field when you're looking for Japanese beetles. And we do recommend foliar insecticides for control when your silks are clipped to a ½ inch and there is an average of 3 to 5 beetles per ear and pollination is less than 50% complete. And I do want to stress, if pollination has already occurred, it is not economically worthwhile to control these beetles. They won't cause yield loss after pollination is complete. In soybean, there's a different story, of course, right? They cause intense defoliation, but it rarely causes yield loss unless you get above the 20 and 30% thresholds. And that again is our thresholds for insecticide treatments. And again, you want to scout throughout the entire field because of that clustering. So you want to look at the entire canopy. Smaller plants are more susceptible, obviously. We have noticed that the repeated treatments in soybean for stink bugs or for Japanese beetles can actually cause larger outbreaks of stink bugs later on in the season. We'll talk about that in a minute, but that's probably because we're also knocking down a lot of those stink bug predators. And again, we see that even if you control all the Japanese beetles in your field, they do move around a lot. So they can come in from your neighbor's field or from adjacent natural areas. And I do want to stress that soil treatments are not recommended. Killing all the larvae in your field will not prevent them from moving in, the adults moving in later on in the season from neighbors. So that is not an economic viable control strategy. I do want to update you on some of the research that we've been doing at the University of Missouri. So we have a student here that is looking at designing an attract and kill method for Japanese beetles. So attract and kill is when you try to lure a specific pest to a specific area and then annihilate it there with chemicals. And this is similar to sort of the roach motels or the ant baits that you have in your house, that you attract the ants or the roaches to one area and you're not spraying chemicals throughout your entire house. And that's beneficial in an agricultural setting as well for many reasons. One is that you get reduced non-target effects if we aren't spraying the entire field, and we have reduced likelihood of resistance. And again, I'm not really too concerned about resistance for Japanese beetles, but when we have 3 to 4 sprays in soybean for Japanese beetles, we run the risk of having resistance build up with some of our other key pests that are in the soybean system that are being non-target sprayed. So our attract and kill design at the University of Missouri for Japanese beetle, we're using these insecticidal nets, and these are very similar to the nets that they use in Africa for malaria control. They're impregnated with a pyrethroid. It's at a very high rate of pyrethroid, so you don't want to touch these nets, but we're putting them along the outside border of field crops. And we found that these nets are extremely toxic to the Japanese beetle. So if an adult lands on that net for 3 seconds, it picks up a toxic dose and dies. And we've done tests in the field. We've seen that these nets do kill thousands of beetles when they land on these nets. To attract the beetles to the net, we're using the 2-component lure. This is a aggregation pheromone lure specific to Japanese beetle, and it also has a floral lure that will attract females looking for plants to feed on. So these are commercially available lures, and the benefits of these insecticidal nets over the bags or the buckets are that there's a larger kill zone. So the problem with the bags and the buckets that we've seen is that you get a lot of Japanese beetles attracted to the bag, but a lot of them don't actually get into the bag, and you end up attracting more beetles to that area than you're killing. But because the nets are larger, we can hang a lure in the middle of the net, and any beetles that land within 15 or 20 meters even along that net will also die. Additionally, these nets last for the entire season, so you get season-long protection, and that's reduced labor costs because once they're out, you don't have to continually empty bags or buckets. So for our field experiment, we did this last year for the first year in our attract and kill treatments. We had this net set up along one border of soybeans, and then our control treatment, basically we used a standard grower standard where we reached threshold and sprayed. We sprayed that field 2 times throughout the field season. The control was sprayed as a grower standard 2 times with a pyrethroid. The attract and kill had the net along one border and no insecticide applications. So this is basically the field design, and we had a 50-meter buffer in between to space that out, and we replicated this 4 times at Bradford Research Farm. And the methods, we had graduate students for a long field season. They were sampling weekly samples, so they were looking at the foliation. They were also doing sweep samples and collecting the insects to look at the community of insects between the 2 treatments. And they were also analyzing bee bowls, so looking at the effects of pollinators in those systems. And then at the end of the season, they also collected a whole bunch of the soybean seeds and quantified seed damage in the lab. And here are some of our results from 2019. And here on the y-axis, we have percent defoliation. And in the first bar here, we have our attract and kill nets, and then we have our controls. And we saw that insecticides throughout the entire field, up to 20 rows anyways, provided equal protection. So these are equal protection to the insecticidal sprays. It does look like out in rows 6, 8, and 20, there's a little bit more defoliation in the attract and kill. But again, our defoliation in soybean is 20%. So even though it might be statistically different between 7 and 9%, for growers, you still haven't reached that protection level or that injury level of 20 to 30% defoliation for a treatment. So this is pretty positive news, and it looks like the attract and kill, these nets provide equivalent control as the weekly insecticide sprays. What was very interesting is when we took the seeds back to the lab and quantified them for injury, we found that the nets, the attract and kill system, had significantly fewer damaged seeds compared to where we had those weekly insecticide sprays. So again, these are the seeds. We actually looked at it on a whole plant level by opening up and counting and quantifying seed damage. And what we found when we looked at the sweep samples, basically, is that in the attract and kill in the nets, you can see there's a lot more insects in there. And that's what we expected, right? Basically, that means that these insecticides are very effective at controlling Japanese beetle, but they're also knocking down a lot of other non-target species. And we think that they're actually knocking down a lot of the natural enemies that could provide biological control later in the season. And so our working hypothesis here is that we saw that the nets reduce broad spectrum insecticides, but they provide equivalent protection, and they maintain natural enemies in the system. So you have a lot more parasitoid wasps where the nets are, and basically what we think is happening, those parasitoid wasps are attacking the stink bugs that create late season seed damage. And if you look at these seeds here, this is basically what we were seeing when we saw seed damage in the insecticidal spray treatments, and it's very characteristic of stink bug damage. So that's what that looks like. So that's what we think is happening. Basically, when you have those nets out, you get the same amount of control, but you're not killing off the wasps, and then you get better stink bug control later in the season. Again, one caveat to this entire thing is that in 2019, we had lower populations of Japanese beetle, and the nets provided equivalent protection. This year, we have high populations of Japanese beetles, and we're repeating this experiment at Bradford Research Farm. So this fall, we'll have some more numbers, and it'll be interesting to see if the nets provide the same control as they do with higher populations. And our future studies, we hope to reduce the amount of nets that we're deploying. So we have some other additional studies where we're looking at the attractiveness of those lures and how far the beetles basically are attracted to those lures. So the goal would be to have reduced amount of netting out there instead of that long field edge. Maybe we can get it down the netting to a few meters and get the same sort of control. But that's our future research, and we will continue to keep you updated on that as we move forward. So again, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank again all the undergrads and their graduate students. They're the ones out in the field doing all the actual hard work. And with that, I'll end this, and we will take any questions by email. So again, my email's on the beginning, and you can email me with any questions about insects, Japanese beetle, or Gall midge itself. Thank you.